The millionaire's wife accused the maid of stealing and immediately fired her. But what the maid said next left him stunned, bringing him to his knees. Sophia's disorientation usually began before the first light of day. The soft hum of the city gradually coming to life was her natural alarm clock. By the time New York streets were bustling, she was already on her way to the mansion where she worked. Her life had always been a careful balance of duty and survival. She juggled the responsibility of caring for her ailing mother, Margaret, and working long hours as a housekeeper for the affluent Benson family. The mansion of John and Natalie Benson stood out in its neighborhood, a true architectural marvel, with sleek glass and sharp lines. It was the type of house that made passers-by stop and stare. For Sophia, however, the mansion served as a constant reminder of the vast divide between her life and theirs. Inside those grand walls, she spent her days scrubbing floors, polishing furniture, and maintaining a sense of invisibility. That was her job, to stay out of sight, to blend in. Just another fixture in the Bensons' lavish world. Natalie Benson was the type of woman who made it clear that she was the one in charge. She moved through the mansion like a queen, her heels clicking authoritatively on the marble floors, her gaze cold and calculating. Though Natalie rarely spoke directly to Sophia, her presence was felt in every corner of the house. Commands were passed on in whispers to the head of staff, and everyone understood that crossing her was not an option. But it was John Benson who always piqued Sophia's curiosity. He was distant, yes, but there was something else in his manner that intrigued her. Unlike Natalie, he wasn't cruel, but he wasn't particularly kind either. He acknowledged her with curt nods, and occasionally their eyes would meet from across the room, as if he were trying to place her, to recall something from the past. Sophia often wondered why he treated her differently than the other staff. It was as if there was an unspoken respect, though he never voiced it. But despite these fleeting moments of acknowledgement from John, Sophia made sure to keep her distance. She couldn't afford to stand out, especially when her primary concern was her mother's health. Margaret's illness had become a heavy burden in recent years, with medical bills draining every bit of the little money Sophia earned. Every penny from her job at the mansion went toward Margaret's care. Doctors, medications, rent for their small apartment. There was no room for error. Losing her job would mean losing everything. On this particular morning, the air inside the mansion felt especially heavy. The staff moved quietly, heads down, as if trying to avoid drawing attention. Something felt off, but Sophia couldn't quite pinpoint it. The tension in the air was palpable, and soon she discovered why. Natalie had lost something precious. While wiping down the dining room table, she overheard a conversation in the kitchen. "Did you hear about the necklace?" one maid whispered. "The diamond one?" another responded in a hushed tone. "Yeah, it's gone. Mrs. Benson is furious." Sophia's heart sank. She recognized that necklace. It was Natalie's prized possession, often worn to parties or during meetings with John's business partners. It was so expensive, it could likely cover her mother's medical expenses for years. Losing it wasn't just a misfortune, it was a disaster. And if Natalie was this upset, someone would soon take the blame. By the time Sophia headed upstairs to continue her work, Natalie's voice echoed down the hallway, rising in anger. The staff hurried to avoid her, retreating to side rooms or pretending to be busier than usual. How could this happen? Natalie's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and accusing. "This is unacceptable. I want answers." Sophia's pulse quickened. She knew that tone, it was never a good sign. Trouble was brewing, and she had no desire to be caught in the middle of it. But before she could slip away unnoticed, Natalie stormed into the room where Sophia was cleaning. Her eyes locked on Sophia. "You!" Natalie snapped, her gaze seething with accusation. "Where were you this morning?" Sophia froze, cleaning rags still in hand, her mind racing. "I was downstairs," she stammered. "I haven't touched anything, Mrs. Benson, I swear." Natalie stepped closer, her icy eyes boring into Sophia. "We'll see about that," she hissed before turning sharply and marching out of the room. Sophia's hands trembled as she went back to her work. She had a sinking feeling this wouldn't end well. The atmosphere at the Benson mansion grew even more tense as the day wore on. Natalie's suspicion weighed heavily on Sophia, following her like a shadow. She tried to focus on her tasks, But her thoughts kept returning to the cold accusation in Natalie's eyes. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. And sure enough, it wasn't long before it did. Later that afternoon, as Sophia folded linens in the laundry room, the door burst open with such force that she jumped. Natalie stormed in, her face twisted in rage. Right behind her was John, his expression troubled but silent. A few other staff members hovered in the hallway, their wide eyes betraying their concern. Without wasting a moment, Natalie pointed an accusatory finger at Sophia, her voice rising as she addressed the group. "This woman," she spat, "has stolen from me. The diamond necklace, the one John gave me for our anniversary, is gone. And she—" Natalie jabbed her finger in Sophia's direction. "She is the thief." The words hit Sophia like a punch to the stomach. She stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Her stomach churned, and her legs felt like they might give way. "I didn't," she began, but Natalie cut her off. "Don't you dare lie to me." Natalie's voice rang out, venomous and sharp. "We all know it was you. You're the only one who had access to my dressing room this morning. You've always been ungrateful for the opportunity to work here. And now your true nature is exposed." Sophia's mind raced. She hadn't even been near Natalie's dressing room. She had spent the morning cleaning downstairs and hadn't even gone upstairs until much later. But it didn't matter. Natalie had already made up her mind. John finally spoke, his voice soft yet resolute. "Natalie, maybe we should." But Natalie quickly cut him off. "No," she snapped, turning sharply to face her husband. "She needs to be fired now. I won't tolerate a thief under my roof." Sophia felt as though the floor had vanished beneath her. Fired? How could this be happening? Losing this job meant losing everything. The care for her mother, their apartment, the delicate balance of their lives. Her entire existence hinged on her income from the Bensons. She turned to John, her eyes filled with desperation. "Mr. Benson, please. I didn't do it. I would never steal from anyone. You have to believe me." For a moment John met her gaze, and Sophia could have sworn she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or even sympathy. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He looked away, rubbing his temple, as if he could will the entire situation away with one simple motion. "I think," he hesitated, glancing between his wife and Sophia. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I think it's best if we handle this quietly. Let's not make it a public spectacle." But Natalie wasn't interested in discretion. Her voice dripped with disdain as she scoffed. "This is my house. I will not be humiliated by some lowly maid who thinks she can steal from me. She needs to be gone today." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. She had to defend herself, but the words felt like they were stuck in her throat. She looked around the room hoping anyone would step in, but the other staff members avoided her gaze, keeping their heads down. They all knew better than to challenge Natalie. "I swear to you I didn't do this," Sophia managed, her voice shaking. "I've always done my best here. I would never." But her plea was drowned out by Natalie's fury. "Enough!" she shouted, her face red with rage. "Pack your things and get out. I don't want to see your face in this house again." Sophia's hands trembled as she took a step back, her mind spinning. Fired. Just like that. Her entire world was crumbling around her. She opened her mouth to protest one last time, but before she could speak, John gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Go," he said quietly, avoiding her gaze. "It's for the best." And with that it was over. The final blow. A cold wave of realization washed over Sophia as the gravity of the situation sank in. Her job, the one thing that had kept her and her mother afloat, was gone. Just like that. Erased by a single accusation. She turned and walked out of the laundry room, her legs shaky, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She refused to let them fall in front of them. As she made her way up the stairs to gather her things, she heard Natalie's voice behind her, quieter now but still filled with venom. "You're lucky I'm not calling the police." Sophia didn't respond. What was the point? She knew she was innocent, but in Natalie's world, innocence didn't matter. All that mattered was power. And Natalie held all of it in her hands. Sophia packed the few belongings she had into a small, worn bag and zipped it up, her mind racing. What would she tell her mother? How could she explain this without making things worse? They barely had enough to survive as it was. What would they do now? But even as the weight of her situation pressed down on her, something deeper stirred inside her. An old memory. A story her mother had told her long ago. One that had faded over time but was now coming back into sharp focus. A secret that might change everything. Sophia wiped her eyes, stood tall, and with a new determination walked down the stairs. The mansion, which had once been her workplace, now felt like a prison, hostile, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on her. She passed the other staff, who all offered sympathetic glances but none dared to speak up. Everyone knew better than to oppose Natalie Benson, especially after such a public display. Her small bag felt heavy on her shoulder, but the weight in her chest was much greater. The thought of returning to her ailing mother and explaining how she had lost her job filled her with dread. Margaret's condition had only worsened, and without Sophia's steady income, they were on the verge of losing everything. How could she possibly face her now? As Sophia neared the front door, her hand lingered on the doorknob. This was it, the end of everything she had worked so hard to maintain. But something inside her wouldn't let go without a fight. The memory from earlier had become clearer, and it gave her just enough courage to turn around and walk back down the long hallway toward John's study. She didn't knock. She simply opened the door slowly and stepped inside. John sat at his desk, his brow furrowed as he stared at a piece of paper. When he looked up and saw her standing there, his expression was one of surprise but not anger. "Sophia," he said softly, as though he had expected this moment. "I thought you'd left." Sophia's throat went dry, but she managed to speak. "Mr. Benson, I didn't steal that necklace. I swear on my life I didn't. But there's something else you need to know. Something I didn't want to say before, but now I have no choice." John leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "Go on," he said, his voice steady. Sophia swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't planned on revealing this, certainly not in such a rushed, desperate moment. But now there was no turning back. "My mother, Margaret. She always told me that before I was born she had a relationship with a man who left her before he ever knew she was pregnant. She never wanted me to find him. She said it was better this way. But she always said his name." John's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything. Sophia continued, her voice trembling. "His name was John Benson." The room went still. John stared at her, unblinking. His face grew pale. For what felt like an eternity he said nothing. Sophia's heart sank. Maybe she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe it was all just some wild coincidence. Finally John spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret." The way he said her mother's name, soft, full of emotion, told Sophia everything she needed to know. He remembered. "I loved her," John murmured, almost to himself. "It was so long ago. I didn't know. I never knew." Sophia reached into her bag, her hands trembling, and pulled out the letter. The fragile, yellowed letter her mother had kept all these years. It was worn with time, but the writing was still legible. Sophia gently placed the letter on John's desk, her eyes fixed on him as he slowly reached for it. The faded ink seemed to pull him into a quiet moment of reflection as he read the words, each line weighing heavily on him. "I don't know why she never told you," Sophia said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this is the proof." John read the letter in silence, his expression shifting from disbelief to something much more profound. Regret, perhaps, or maybe guilt. It was difficult for Sophia to say, but whatever it was, it ran deep. When he finally set the letter back down on the desk, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with an emotion she wasn't prepared for. "I should have known," he said, his voice thick, almost choked with emotion. "But I was young and foolish. When her family forced us apart, I thought it was the end. I didn't know she was pregnant." Sophia's heart twinged with sympathy. This wasn't how she'd imagined telling him, but now that the truth had spilled out, there was no taking it back. She stood there, unsure of what to say next, or if there was anything left to say at all. "I'm sorry," John murmured, standing and walking toward her, his eyes distant but full of something new, perhaps regret or perhaps acceptance. I don't know what to say. All these years. And I never knew." You're my daughter. The words hung in the air between them, so heavy with meaning that Sophia almost couldn't breathe. She felt a tightness in her chest, but she held back her tears. She had spent too many years learning how to keep her emotions in check. I didn't know either, Sophia admitted, her voice faltering. Not until recently. My mother didn't want me to know. But after everything that's happened, I couldn't keep it a secret any longer. John stood frozen for a moment, running his hand through his hair, as if trying to make sense of it all. This changes everything, he whispered to himself, his voice thick with disbelief. I need time. I need to think. Sophia nodded slowly, understanding the enormity of what she had just revealed to him. I didn't come here asking for anything from you, Mr. Benson. I just thought you had the right to know the truth. That's all. Before John could respond, the door suddenly flew open, and Natalie stormed in, her face flushed with anger. She hadn't expected to find Sophia still standing there, and the sight of her seemed to ignite an even fiercer rage. What is she still doing here? Natalie demanded, her voice sharp with fury. I told you to get rid of her. John turned his gaze from Sophia to Natalie, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his voice. We need to talk, he said, his tone unwavering. About everything. The air in the room grew thick with tension as Natalie stood, her eyes darting back and forth between John and Sophia, struggling to make sense of what was unfolding before her. For the first time in what felt like years, John looked at Natalie with a determination she had never seen before. It was as though he had made a choice and was ready to follow through, no matter the consequences. What are you talking about? Natalie demanded, her voice dripping with impatience. What's there to discuss? I want her out of this house, John. John took a deep breath, his eyes locking with Natalie's for a moment before turning back to Sophia. There's something you don't know, he said, his voice firm but measured. Something I just learned myself. Natalie's face faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure, her expression hardening. What are you talking about? Sophia could see the uncertainty in John's eyes as he searched for the right words to explain. It wasn't easy, but it had to be said. She isn't just one of the housekeepers here, John began, his voice unwavering. She's my daughter. The silence that followed was suffocating, each second stretching on for what felt like eternity. Natalie's face twisted with disbelief. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open as though she could hardly comprehend what John had just said. She took a step back, as though the revelation itself was too much to bear. What? Natalie whispered harshly, her voice barely audible. What did you just say? John met her gaze, his expression unwavering. It's true. Margaret, Sophia's mother, was someone I was involved with long before we met. We were separated before I ever knew she was pregnant. And now I've found out that Sophia is my daughter. Natalie's shock quickly turned into fury. She let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head as though she could somehow will the absurdity of it all away. This is absurd, she spat, her voice laced with venom. How could you possibly believe this? She's lying. John, she's manipulating you. Sophia's stomach dropped. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words out loud still stung like a slap to the face. Natalie's voice oozed contempt as she tried to belittle her, to erase the truth. I'm not lying, Sophia said softly, but with firm resolve, stepping forward. She reached into her bag once more, pulling out the letter. This is a letter my mother kept for years. It's from John. Proves everything. Natalie snatched the letter from her hands, scanning it quickly, her eyes darting across the faded ink. Her expression remained unreadable, a mask that seemed to grow colder with each passing moment. When she was done, she tossed the letter aside, as though it were nothing more than an insignificant scrap of paper. This proves nothing, she said, her voice flat. This could be forged. For all we know, you're just some desperate girl trying to get a piece of our life. Sophia bit her lip, her emotions threatening to spill over, but she kept herself in check. She had expected resistance, but hearing it so coldly from Natalie still made her heart ache. She turned to John, silently pleading with him to step in. And he did. Enough, Natalie, John said, his voice booming with authority. I know it's hard to believe, but I don't need any more proof. I remember Margaret and I remember what happened between us. This isn't some scheme. Sophia is telling the truth. Natalie's eyes blazed with fury. So you're just going to accept this? Just like that? You're going to let her manipulate you into believing she's your daughter? John stood tall, his expression unwavering. This isn't up for debate. The truth is the truth, whether you like it or not. For a long moment Natalie said nothing. The weight of John's words hung heavily in the air between them, crackling with tension. Finally, with a sharp intake of breath, Natalie turned on her heel, storming toward the door. But before she left, she paused, delivering her final venomous words. If you want to throw away everything we've built because of this fantasy, she spat, then go ahead. But don't expect me to stand by and watch. With that, she disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps echoing through the mansion. The room fell into an eerie silence, and Sophia felt the weight of everything that had just transpired pressing down on her chest. Sophia wasn't sure if she should feel relieved or guilty, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again after today. John exhaled a long, weary sigh and turned toward her, his face softened by exhaustion. I'm sorry, he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with regret. I know this has been a lot, but I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to make this right. I should have known sooner, he added, running a hand over his face. I should have been there for you. Sophia swallowed hard, her emotions swirling inside her like a storm. She'd dreamed of meeting her father for so long, but never like this, never with such weight, such complication. I didn't come here to make things harder for you, she said, her voice small but steady. I just thought you deserved to know. John nodded, his eyes filled with regret. I appreciate that, he murmured. And now that I know, we can't just let things stay the way they are. I want to help you, Sophia. I want to be a part of your life. If you'll let me. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For the first time she saw a glimpse of the father she had long wondered about. A man who had been missing for so many years, but now seemed willing to make amends. Before Sophia could respond, there was a soft knock at the door, and one of the house staff entered tentatively. Mr. Benson, she said, her voice hesitant. Mrs. Benson has asked that her things be packed. She's leaving. John exchanged a heavy glance with Sophia before releasing another long sigh. It seems things are changing faster than we thought, he muttered. Sophia didn't know how to respond. The weight of the truth hung between them thick and heavy, and for the first time in what felt like ages, the future seemed unclear. But one thing was for sure. Both her life and John's would never be the same. The sound of Natalie's footsteps echoed down the hallway, her departure leaving behind a stillness that was almost deafening. John stood at the window, staring out at the once pristine garden he had always taken pride in. Now it seemed nothing more than a hollow reflection of his life. The manicured hedges, the perfectly trimmed lawns, they meant nothing now. Sophia sat quietly in the corner, unsure of what to do, how to bridge the strange distance between them. She had expected Natalie's fury, but the awkwardness between her and John was more difficult to navigate than she'd imagined. She couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps revealing the truth had been a mistake, but deep down she knew it had been the right thing to do. Still, the look on John's face, the mixture of shock, regret, and something else she couldn't quite place, made her heart ache. He turned away from the window, his movements slow, weighed down by years of secrets. He sank into his chair, rubbing a hand through his graying hair, and let out a heavy sigh. The truth of the situation was beginning to settle in, and it hit him harder than he expected. Margaret, he murmured softly, almost as if speaking to himself. I loved her. I really did. Sophia stayed silent. Hearing him say her mother's name with such tenderness felt strange. Her mother had always been so reserved, rarely speaking of the past. When she did, it was with a quiet sadness, as if that part of her life had already been laid to rest. John looked up at Sophia, his eyes searching her face, perhaps looking for a trace of Margaret, or maybe some understanding that had eluded him all these years. I never knew, he said quietly. I didn't know she was pregnant. If I had known, I would have. His voice trailed off, and the unfinished sentence hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken regrets. Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had imagined what it would be like to meet her father for years, but never had she expected it to be so complex, so full of regret and confusion. "I understand," Sophia said at last, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside her. "I don't blame you. I just thought you should know. That's all." John nodded, his gaze still clouded with guilt. "I wish I had known sooner," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I would have been there for you. For Margaret. I would have done things differently." Sophia appreciated his words, but they didn't change the years that had passed. The years she had spent without him could never be erased, no matter how sincere his apology. Still, she couldn't deny that there was something in his voice now. A hint of a man truly willing to make amends. "I didn't come here asking for anything," Sophia whispered. "I just thought you deserved to know the truth. That's all." John shook his head, leaning forward on his desk as if the weight of his own thoughts was pressing down on him.
"No, Sophia.
You deserve more than that. I should have been there for you. For Margaret." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke her mother's name, and he quickly cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. Sophia shifted in her seat, feeling the tension between them. She had spent so many years imagining this moment, but now that it was here, the reality felt so much more complicated. John seemed to sense her hesitation. He stood up, walking over to where she sat and lowered himself to her level, so their eyes met. "Sophia," he said softly, "I can't change the past, but I want to make things right. I want to help you. You and your mother. Please let me do that." Sophia's throat tightened at his words. The offer was tempting, especially with the strain of her mother's health weighing on her. But something inside her held back. Could she trust him? Could she accept his help after all these years of silence? "I owe it to you," John continued. "I owe it to Margaret. I can't undo the mistakes I've made, but I want to try to make up for them now. Please let me help." Sophia looked down at her hands, the weight of his words pressing heavily on her. She had never expected him to offer this kind of help, and part of her wanted to say yes. But another part of her hesitated. Trust wasn't something that came easily, especially after everything she had been through. "I don't know," Sophia finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you. Not after everything." John nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I don't blame you for feeling that way. But I want to earn your trust, Sophia. I want to be a part of your life if you'll let me." The sincerity in his voice caught her completely off guard. She had expected anger, defensiveness, or even denial, but not this. This openness. This vulnerability. It was clear that John was trying to make things right, but whether or not she could accept it was something she wasn't ready to face just yet. "I need time," Sophia said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I need to think about it," Sophia said quietly, the weight of everything still heavy on her chest. John nodded slowly, rising from his seat. "Take all the time you need," he replied, his voice soft yet understanding. "I'll be here whenever you're ready." Sophia stood as well, clutching her bag tightly to her side. The conversation had been far more emotional than she had anticipated, and now she wasn't sure how to process everything. All she knew was that her life had shifted in a way she never could have predicted. As she made her way toward the door, John's voice stopped her one last time. "Sophia," he called softly. She turned, meeting his gaze. "I'm sorry," he added, his words thick with regret. The apology hung in the air between them, filled with years of lost time and missed opportunities. Sophia nodded, not trusting herself to speak, then left the room, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just been revealed. The next morning, the atmosphere at the Benson mansion was thick with tension. Sophia had returned home after her conversation with John, but sleep had eluded her. She had spent the night tossing and turning, trying to make sense of it all. Her father, John Benson, wanted to be a part of her life. The man she had unknowingly worked for all these years was now offering to help her and her ailing mother. It was too much for her to process in one night. As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Sophia found herself back at the mansion. Her mind was heavy with uncertainty. She didn't know what to do next, but she knew she needed to speak with John again. There were too many questions left unanswered, too many loose ends. When she arrived, the house felt quieter than usual, as though it too sensed the change in the air. The staff moved about their duties with a nervous energy, as if they feared what was about to come. Sophia made her way to the study, hoping for a private conversation with John. But as she reached the door, she heard voices inside, voices growing louder by the second. "I will not be humiliated like this." Natalie's voice rang out, sharp and filled with venom. "Do you understand, John? This is my house, my life. And I will not let some girl, some maid, come in here and tear it apart." Sophia's heart raced as she pressed her ear to the door. She knew she shouldn't be eavesdropping, but she couldn't help herself. She needed to know what was being said. "I'm not asking for your permission," John's voice replied, calm but firm. "This isn't about you, Natalie. It's about the truth. Sophia is my daughter, and I'm not turning my back on her." There was a stunned silence before Natalie spoke again, her voice trembling with fury. "How can you say that?" she hissed. "You don't even know her. She's probably lying, trying to take advantage of you. Of us. Can't you see that?" John's tone hardened. "She's not lying. I knew her mother, Natalie. I loved her mother. And if I had known about Sophia all those years ago, things would have been different." Sophia's stomach dropped at his words. John had loved her mother. The revelation hit her like a wave. A painful reminder of all the things Margaret had kept buried. The one thing Sophia had longed to know was now painfully clear. Natalie let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, please. Don't try to romanticize the past, John. That was a lifetime ago. And now you want to drag all of that back into our lives? What about us? What about everything we've built together?" John's voice softened slightly, but there was still an edge to it. "Natalie, I'm not asking you to like this, but I can't ignore it anymore. Sophia is my daughter, and I have a responsibility to her." Sophia couldn't stand it any longer. She pushed open the door, stepping into the room. Both John and Natalie turned to look at her, their faces a mix of surprise and tension. Natalie's eyes narrowed instantly, her lips curling into a sneer. "What are you doing here?" Natalie snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "Haven't you caused enough damage already?" Sophia's hands trembled, but she stood her ground. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," she said quietly. "I just came to talk to John." Natalie's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't get to call him that. He's my husband, and this is my house. You don't belong here." John intervened before things could escalate further. "That's enough," he said firmly, stepping between them. "Enough, Natalie." But Natalie wasn't done. She stepped closer to Sophia, eyes blazing. "You think you can just waltz in here, claim you're his daughter, and everything will magically change? You're nobody. You're nothing. You were hired to clean this house, not tear apart our family." Sophia's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I never wanted any of this," she said softly. "I just wanted the truth. I didn't even know who my father was until recently." Natalie scoffed bitterly. "The truth? You don't care about the truth. You care about money. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You see an opportunity to cash in, and you're taking it." Sophia felt the sting of Natalie's words, but before she could respond, John stepped in between them, his voice cold and unwavering. "Stop it, Natalie. This isn't about money. Sophia isn't here for any of that. She's here because she deserves to know the truth, just like I do." Natalie's face twisted in disgust. "And what about me, John?" she sneered. "Don't I deserve something here? I've been your wife for years. I've stood by your side, and now you're throwing it all away for her." John turned to face his wife, regret in his eyes but resolve in his voice. "I'm not throwing anything away, but I can't ignore what's right in front of me. Sophia is my daughter, and that changes things." The room fell silent, the tension thick and palpable. Natalie's fists clenched at her sides, her face flushed with fury. She opened her mouth to say something but then closed it, as though struggling to find the right words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice chillingly calm. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "And when this all blows up in your face, don't come crying to me." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the mansion, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Sophia stood there, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She hadn't expected Natalie to lash out like that, But it didn't surprise her. Natalie would do anything to protect her life, her status. And Sophia now was a threat to all of it. John let out a long, weary breath, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off the headache that was surely forming. "I'm sorry about that," John said, his voice tired and drained. "Natalie, she's not handling this well." Sophia shook her head, not wanting him to blame himself. "It's not your fault," she replied quietly. "I know this is a lot. I didn't expect it to be easy." John's gaze lingered on her, his eyes full of something that Sophia couldn't quite identify. Perhaps guilt, perhaps regret, or maybe something deeper. She wasn't sure. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he admitted with a sigh. "But I'll make sure you and your mother are taken care of. That's a promise." Sophia nodded, grateful for his words, but uncertain about what the future held. The truth had come out, but the consequences were only just beginning. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at the Benson mansion felt like walking on eggshells. Natalie had retreated to her bedroom, barely speaking to anyone, her presence more ominous than ever. She was like a storm brewing, ready to burst at any moment, and the staff seemed to sense it. They moved around quietly, exchanging nervous glances but keeping their distance from both Natalie and John. Sophia, on the other hand, kept to herself. She didn't know what to do next. Her relationship with John was still so new, and although he had promised to help her and her mother, she didn't know how to navigate the complicated web of emotions that had spun out of control. Part of her wanted to leave the mansion, to walk away from it all and never look back. But another part of her knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. One afternoon, as Sophia was about to leave the mansion for the day, John called her into his study. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice serious. Sophia nodded, stepping into the room. The last time they had spoken here, so much had changed. She wasn't sure what else there was to reveal, but she could tell from the look on John's face that this conversation wouldn't be easy. "Please sit down," he motioned, his voice softer than before. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened. There's something I need to get to the bottom of." Sophia's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" John leaned forward, his expression hardening. "The necklace. Natalie's necklace that went missing. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this than we know." Sophia's heart sank. She hadn't thought much about the necklace since that day when Natalie had accused her. Between the revelations about her parentage and the turmoil that followed, it had slipped from her mind. But now, hearing John mention it again, the weight of that accusation came rushing back. "I swear, Mr. Benson," Sophia said quickly, her voice firm, "I had nothing to do with that necklace. I don't know where it is or why Natalie accused me." John raised a hand to stop her. "I believe you," he said gently, his tone reassuring. "I never thought you were involved in that. But Natalie's behavior, I've been thinking about it, and something doesn't add up." Sophia blinked, surprised by his confidence. "What do you mean?" "She was so quick to blame you, so quick to make it public," John said, his voice tense. "Something about that doesn't sit right with me." Sophia's stomach tightened, and she found herself holding her breath. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John's jaw tightened. "I don't think the necklace was stolen at all," he said. "I think Natalie hid it herself." Sophia's eyes widened in shock. "Why would she do that?" John sighed, leaning back in his chair. "To get rid of you. From the moment she realized you were a threat to her status in this house, she wanted you gone. She must have seen you as a danger. Someone who could unravel everything she's worked so hard to keep together." A chill ran down Sophia's spine. "But why accuse me of stealing? Why not just fire me?" John's eyes darkened. "Because if she accused you of something as serious as theft, it would discredit you completely. Not just here but everywhere. No one would hire you again. She wanted to ruin you." Sophia's hands trembled in her lap. She had always known that Natalie didn't like her. But this level of cruelty was something she hadn't expected. Natalie hadn't just wanted her out of the house. She had wanted to destroy her entire future. But why? Why? Sophia whispered, her voice small. "What did I ever do to her?" John's gaze softened with sadness. "You didn't do anything. But the moment Natalie realized you were my daughter, whether she admitted it to herself or not, she saw you as a threat. A threat to everything she had built here. Sophia stared at the floor, her mind racing. It made sense now, the cold looks, the snide comments, the swift accusation. Natalie had known, even if she never said it aloud, that Sophia's connection to John threatened her carefully constructed world. And instead of confronting that truth, she had chosen to destroy Sophia before anyone else could discover it. "What are you going to do?" Sophia asked, looking up at John. John rubbed his temples, clearly exhausted by the situation. "I'm going to confront her. I can't let this go on. She needs to tell the truth, and she needs to take responsibility for what she's done." Sophia nodded, though the thought of confronting Natalie made her stomach churn. She wasn't sure what to expect from the woman anymore. Natalie had always been calculating, but if she had gone so far as to frame Sophia for theft, there was no telling what she might do next. Later that evening, John called Natalie into the study. Sophia stayed outside, lingering in the hallway just close enough to hear their conversation. Her heart raced as she listened to their voices, tense and sharp. "I want the truth, Natalie," John said, his voice stern. "I know you hid the necklace. I know you accused Sophia of stealing it to get rid of her." There was a long pause before Natalie spoke again, her voice cold and defensive. "You're being ridiculous. I did no such thing." "You can stop lying," John snapped. "I'm not going to let this go. You owe Sophia an apology, and you owe me the truth." Sophia could imagine the look on Natalie's face, the tightness of her lips, the narrowing of her eyes. Then, to Sophia's surprise, Natalie spoke again, her voice low but filled with bitterness. "So what if I did?" she hissed. "What difference does it make? You've already chosen her over me." John's voice softened, but it remained firm. "This isn't about choosing sides. It's about doing what's right. You tried to destroy her life for your own selfish reasons, and that's something I can't forgive." There was another pause, and Sophia could hear Natalie's voice, quieter now, but still dripping with venom. "You've ruined everything, John. Everything with that." The door to the study swung open, and Natalie stormed out, her face flushed with anger. She didn't even glance at Sophia as she passed, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floors. Sophia watched Natalie walk away, a complex mixture of relief and sadness flooding her chest. John stepped out of the study, his face tired but resolute. "It's over," he said quietly. She admitted it. Sophia nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. The truth was out, but the damage had already been done. Now they were left to pick up the pieces. Natalie's departure left an emptiness in the mansion, the silence ringing louder than any argument had. The sharp click of Natalie's heels echoed down the hallway as she stormed off, and for the first time, the mansion didn't feel dominated by her presence. It felt like it could be Sophia's, like it could be John's, no longer overshadowed by Natalie's overbearing control. But with that came the heavy truth that nothing would ever be the same again. Sophia stood in the hallway, watching John's face as he processed everything that had happened. He looked exhausted, more tired than she had ever seen him. His broad shoulders slumped slightly, as though the weight of all the years of deception and miscommunication had finally caught up with him. "She's leaving," John said after a long pause, his voice thick with exhaustion. "She'll pack her things and be gone by morning." Sophia wasn't sure how to feel. The woman who had tormented her, framed her, and tried to ruin her life was finally being removed from the mansion. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the quiet, bitter end of a painful chapter that neither she nor John could ever truly erase. John turned to face her, his eyes softening. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice filled with regret. "I should have seen this coming. I should have protected you from her." Sophia shook her head, trying to ease his guilt. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "You couldn't have known." John let out a deep sigh and walked past her toward the living room. "Even so," he murmured, "I've let too many things slide over the years. I should have done better. Been better for you. For your mother. For everyone." Sophia followed him into the room, unsure of what to say. She had only just begun to get to know John as her father, but seeing this vulnerable side of him made her realize how much he was grappling with. Years of mistakes, regrets, and missed opportunities hung between them. She could see the weight of it all pressing down on him. John sank into one of the large armchairs, rubbing his temples as if trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The image of the powerful, wealthy businessman, the one who had always been in control, had crumbled. What sat before her now was a man facing the consequences of choices he could no longer undo. "I need to talk to her," John said suddenly, breaking the silence. Sophia frowned, confused. "Talk to who?" "Margaret," John replied steadily. "Your mother. I owe her an apology. More than anyone." Sophia's heart skipped a beat at the mention of her mother's name. Margaret had always been quiet and private, never one to dwell on the past. But now, with John wanting to confront that past, Sophia wasn't sure how her mother would react. Margaret had kept the truth from Sophia for so many years, and now everything was being unearthed. "I don't know if she'll want to see you," Sophia admitted, her voice unsure. "She's complicated." John nodded, understanding. "I know, but I have to try. I can't just leave things like this. I've already lost so much time." Sophia wasn't sure what to say. Part of her wanted to protect her mother from the emotional turmoil that might come with seeing John again. But another part of her knew that this was something they both needed to face. If there was any hope of moving forward, they had to confront the past together. "I'll talk to her," Sophia finally said, her voice quiet but determined. "I'll let her know." John smiled, though it was a sad, weary smile, one weighed down by years of missed connections. "Thank you," he said softly. "I appreciate that." The hours that followed were quieter than they had ever been at the mansion. The staff moved around in silence, carefully packing Natalie's things, their faces blank, avoiding eye contact with both John and Sophia. Everyone knew that a storm had just passed through the house, but no one dared to speak of it openly. Sophia sat by the window in one of the smaller sitting rooms, watching as the sun began to set over the city. Her mind swirled with a hurricane of emotions: relief, uncertainty, fear. She had come into this mansion as a housekeeper, but now her life had been irrevocably changed. It felt like she was standing on the edge of something new, but she wasn't sure what that something was yet. Later that evening, as Sophia prepared to leave, she saw Natalie in the hallway. She was standing near the door, watching as the last of her bags were loaded into a sleek black car. Her posture was stiff, her expression unreadable. But when their eyes met, something shifted. For a fleeting moment, the bitterness and anger that had defined Natalie seemed to fade, replaced by something else. Something softer, quieter. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes wasn't full of hatred, as it often had been. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't the venomous disdain that Sophia had come to expect, either. It was resignation. A quiet acceptance that her time at the Benson mansion was over. Without a word, Natalie turned and walked out the door. The sound of the car engine starting broke the silence, and just like that, she was gone. Sophia stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Natalie was out of her life, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something painful, unresolved. That night, Sophia returned home to her small apartment. Her thoughts were heavy with everything that had transpired. Margaret was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes tired but warm as always. "How was work?" Margaret asked gently, her voice soft. Sophia hesitated, unsure of how to explain everything. How could she tell her mother about John, about Natalie, about the missing necklace? It all seemed too overwhelming, too complicated. But as she sat down next to Margaret, she realized that this was the moment. The moment she'd been waiting for. The moment to tell her everything. "Mom," Sophia began softly, "there's something I need to tell you." Margaret's brow furrowed in concern. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sophia took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's about John Benson. He's my father." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. For a long moment Margaret didn't speak. Her eyes widened in shock, and then, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret let out a long, shaky breath. "I knew this day would come," she whispered. Sophia stared at her mother, confused. "You knew?" Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I knew you'd find out one day. I just didn't know when." Sophia felt a surge of emotion, relief mixed with confusion. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you keep this from me all these years?" Margaret wiped away a tear, her hands trembling as she spoke. "I was trying to protect you." Margaret murmured, her voice fragile. "I didn't want you to carry the burden of knowing that your father abandoned us. I thought it would be easier this way." Sophia felt a tight knot form in her chest. She understood why her mother had kept the truth from her. But understanding didn't make the hurt any less sharp. Years of silence and unanswered questions couldn't be erased so easily, no matter how much she tried to make sense of it. "I met him," Sophia said. Her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "He wants to help us. He wants to see you." Margaret's eyes widened, a flash of something vulnerable crossing her face. For a long moment Sophia thought her mother might refuse, but then Margaret slowly nodded, a quiet surrender. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll see him." The next day felt thick with anticipation. Sophia could feel it in every breath, every moment. The weight of what was about to happen, the meeting of her mother and John, after all these years of silence. Sophia didn't know how it would go, but she knew it had to happen. The past had hung over them for too long. Margaret sat at the kitchen table that morning, her hands gripping a mug of tea as she stared out the window. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, clouded with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. She didn't speak much and Sophia didn't push her. She understood that some things couldn't be rushed. Her mother needed this time to process, to find the strength to face the past. By mid-afternoon, John had arranged for a car to take them to a small, quiet cafe in the city. It wasn't the kind of grand location John might usually choose, but it felt right. Neutral ground. A place where they could have a conversation without the weight of wealth or status hanging over them. A space to be honest, away from the expectations of the world around them. As the car pulled up in front of their building, Sophia glanced at her mother. "Are you ready?" she asked gently, wanting to make sure her mother was okay. But Sophia could see the hesitation in Margaret's eyes, the uncertainty that mirrored her own. Margaret took a deep breath and nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly. "I think so," she whispered. The cafe was small but inviting, tucked away on a quiet street. When they arrived, John was already there, seated at a corner table, his eyes betraying a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. When he saw them, he immediately stood, his gaze locking with Margaret's. For a brief moment it felt like time stopped, the weight of years passing between them in that silent exchange. Margaret took a hesitant step forward. John mirrored her, his expression softening, though still carrying the marks of regret and longing. Sophia watched, her heart in her throat. She didn't know what would happen next, or if either of them would say anything at all. The tension was palpable. When they finally stood face to face, it was as if the entire room held its breath. John's eyes were full of regret, Margaret's filled with years of hurt. "Margaret," John said, his voice cracking slightly. Margaret looked at him, her eyes flashing with a combination of pain and something deeper, something that felt like old wounds being reopened. For a second Sophia feared her mother might walk away, but then Margaret's voice, barely above a whisper, responded, "John." The word hung in the air, full of unspoken meaning, a history that couldn't be ignored. They stood there suspended in time, as if searching for the right words to undo what had been done, to find a way back to what they had lost. "I'm sorry," John said finally, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know. I didn't know about Sophia. If I had known." Margaret raised a hand, silencing him. "Don't," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "Don't tell me what you would have done. We both know it wasn't that simple." John's shoulders slumped and he nodded, accepting the weight of her words. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I can't change the past. But I want to make things right, Margaret. I want to be there for you. For Sophia." Margaret's gaze softened as she turned to Sophia, her eyes filled with an unspoken apology. "I kept the truth from her because I thought it would protect her," she said, her voice faltering. I thought it was the right thing to do." John shook his head, his eyes filled with understanding. "You did what you thought was best. I don't fault you for that. But now we have a chance to do something different. To be there for her. To be a family." Sophia felt her chest tighten at his words. For the first time the possibility of something new, something hopeful, seemed within reach. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. This wasn't a fairy tale, and there were still so many wounds to heal. Margaret paused, her eyes flickering between John and Sophia. I don't know how to do this, she admitted quietly. It's been so long. And there's so much that's been left unsaid. John reached out, his hand gently brushing hers. We'll figure it out, he said softly. One step at a time. For Sophia. Margaret looked down at their hands, her eyes welling with tears. She had been holding everything in for so long, and now with the weight of it all finally coming to the surface, she seemed to be on the verge of breaking. For a moment she looked as though she might retreat, but then slowly she nodded. Okay, she whispered. One step at a time. John smiled. A small tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. A sign that even if things couldn't be perfect, there was still hope. The possibility of healing. They all sat down at the table. The conversation shifted, becoming quieter, more reflective. They spoke about the past, about their decisions, their regrets, and the path that had led them to this moment. John apologized repeatedly, though Margaret insisted they couldn't dwell on what had already happened. The damage was done, but the future wasn't written yet. Sophia watched them, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt something shift within her. The past couldn't be undone, but maybe, just maybe, they could find peace in the present. As they finished their coffee, John turned to Sophia. His voice was soft but firm. I want to be a part of your life, he said. I know I've missed so much, but if you'll let me, I want to help you and your mother. Sophia looked at her mother, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. It was a lot to take in. This sudden presence of a father she had never known, the offer of help, the chance to build something new. But as she sat there, for the first time in her life, surrounded by both her parents, something inside her began to shift. I'd like that, Sophia said softly, her voice full of emotion she could barely name. I'd like that a lot. John smiled again, this time with warmth that seemed to radiate from him. For the first time in what felt like ages, Margaret reached out to squeeze Sophia's hand, an action so simple yet so profound. The touch felt like a bridge between the past and the future. Sophia felt a flicker of hope spark in her chest. It wasn't a perfect reunion. Not by any means, and there were still so many challenges ahead. But this was a start. That was enough. The days following the reunion at the cafe were a whirlwind of emotions for Sophia. Her relationship with John, though still new and fragile, was beginning to take shape in ways she hadn't expected. After years of working under his roof without truly knowing him, she now found herself trying to understand him as her father. A man who had missed so much of her life, but who now seemed determined to make up for lost time. John, true to his word, made an effort to visit both Sophia and Margaret regularly. At first, it was awkward, like strangers trying to find their footing in a relationship that had been denied to them for so long. The weight of the past hung over every conversation. But with each visit, the tension slowly began to ease. They found small things to talk about. Sophia's childhood, Margaret's memories of their life together, John's experiences as a businessman. These weren't deep conversations, but they were a foundation. A way of bridging the gap between what had been and what could be. One evening, John arrived at their apartment with a quiet sense of anticipation. He'd called ahead, asking if he could speak with both Sophia and Margaret together. There was something different in the way he'd spoken, a tone that suggested this conversation would be unlike their usual visits. Sophia opened the door, feeling a slight nervousness she hadn't expected. Hey, Dad, she said, the words still new, still strange on her tongue, but she was getting more comfortable with them. John smiled back, his expression full of warmth, and she could see the genuine affection in his eyes. Hey, sweetheart, he replied, his voice gentle. I'm glad you're both here. Margaret sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on John. She was still adjusting to his presence in their lives again, and while the sharp edges of her bitterness had softened, there were still moments when Sophia saw the quiet sadness in her eyes, as though she were mourning the years lost between them. John walked over to the small dining table and placed a box down gently. I've been thinking a lot about the future, he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. About how I want to be a better father, a better man for both of you. And I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make things right. Sophia and Margaret exchanged a glance, unsure of where John was going with this. There was a heavy pause, the silence thick with anticipation. He took a deep breath and continued, I want to help you both in any way I can. I know one of the biggest challenges has been the financial burden, especially with Margaret's medical bills. So I've taken care of them. Sophia's heart skipped a beat, and she blinked, her mind struggling to process what John had just said. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John opened the box, revealing a stack of papers. These are all the outstanding bills for your mother's treatment, he explained. I've paid them in full. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes widened in disbelief. I don't know what to say. John's gaze softened as he looked at Margaret. You don't have to say anything, he said gently. This is the least I can do. I should have been here from the beginning, but since I wasn't, I want to do everything I can now. Sophia was speechless. The weight of her mother's illness and the ever-growing medical bills had been hanging over them for years, a constant source of anxiety. It was the reason Sophia had worked so tirelessly at the Benson mansion, always fearful that they wouldn't be able to meet the costs. And now, with a single gesture, John had lifted that burden from her shoulders. Thank you, Sophia said, her voice trembling as emotion swelled within her. You have no idea how much this means to us. John reached out, taking Sophia's hand in his. I'm just sorry it took me so long to get here, he said softly. But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere. Margaret, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke. John, I never wanted you to feel obligated, she began, her voice thick with emotion. I kept Sophia from you because I didn't want to complicate your life. But seeing you here doing all of this for us, I realize now that I made a mistake. I should have told you from the beginning. John shook his head, his expression full of regret. No, Margaret, he said, his voice steady. You did what you thought was right at the time. I can't blame you for that. But now we have a chance to make things better, for all of us. There was a long lingering pause. The three of them sat together in the quiet of the small apartment, the weight of years of unspoken truths hanging in the air. It wasn't easy to navigate this new relationship, but the desire to move forward was stronger than the pain of the past. Sophia looked at her mother and then at John, the two of them so different, so complicated, yet bound together by their shared history. We've all made mistakes, Sophia said softly, but I think we're ready to start over, to be a family, in whatever way that works for us. John's eyes glistened with emotion as he nodded. I'd like that, he said quietly. I'd like that a lot. For the rest of the evening they sat together speaking of the future. John shared his plans for how he wanted to be more involved in Sophia's life, how he wanted to help her pursue her dreams, whatever they might be. Margaret, for the first time in years, seemed lighter, as if the burden of the past had finally been lifted from her shoulders. As the night wore on, Sophia felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't perfect. There were still many unresolved emotions, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she had a family. A real family. Before John left, he stood by the door, looking at both Sophia and Margaret with a mixture of gratitude and hope. I'm here whenever you need me, he said. And I'm not going anywhere this time. Sophia smiled, her heart full, a quiet joy rising in her chest. We know, she said softly. We know. As the door closed behind him, Sophia and Margaret sat in the quiet of their apartment, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. It wasn't the life Sophia had expected, but it was a life filled with possibility, with hope. And for the first time she allowed herself to believe that things would get better. In the weeks that followed, the sense of change in Sophia's life became undeniable. What had once been a daily struggle to keep her head above water was now a tentative journey toward something new, something better. With John's support, the burden of her mother's medical bills was no longer an ever-present worry. The future, for the first time in years, felt less like an impossible climb and more like a path she could walk, one step at a time. John had kept true to his word. He visited frequently, spending time with both Sophia and Margaret. Though his relationship with Margaret remained complicated, and the years of separation couldn't be erased in a few short weeks, they were slowly learning how to be in each other's lives again. There were still unspoken words between them, wounds that would take time to heal. But both of them were trying, and that was enough for now. Sophia, on the other hand, found herself adjusting to the idea of having a father, a real father who cared about her. John had become a steady presence in her life, not just as a benefactor, but as someone who could be relied on for emotional support as well. John smiled again, this time with a warmth that felt genuine and comforting. For the first time in years, Margaret reached over and squeezed Sophia's hand, a gesture that spoke volumes about the quiet bond that was beginning to rebuild between them. Sophia felt a swell of hope rise within her. It wasn't a perfect reunion, nor would the road ahead be without challenges. But this was a start, and that in itself was enough. The days that followed their reunion were a whirlwind of emotions for Sophia. Her relationship with John was still in its infancy, fragile and uncertain, but she could feel it taking root in ways she hadn't anticipated. After years of living under the same roof, yet never truly knowing him, Sophia was now finding herself trying to understand John as a father, a man who had missed so much of her life, but who was now determined to be present in whatever way he could. True to his word, John made a consistent effort to visit Sophia and Margaret. At first, their meetings were awkward. The three of them were still learning how to occupy the same space, the weight of their past hanging over every conversation. But with each visit, they began to find common ground. Conversations about Sophia's childhood, Margaret's memories of their life before everything changed, John's experiences in the business world. These simple exchanges began to form the foundation of trust, small and tentative, but growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, John invited them both to his mansion for a small gathering. It was meant to be a quiet event, just the three of them, marking a new chapter in their relationship. The mansion, once a place where Sophia had felt invisible, where she had walked through the grand halls as nothing more than a housekeeper, now felt different. It no longer loomed over her as a reminder of a life she didn't belong to. This time she entered it as someone who had a place there. As they sat in the bright, sunlit dining room, John raised a glass to toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice steady but carrying an emotion that made Sophia's chest tighten. "For all of us." Sophia and Margaret exchanged a glance before raising their glasses, echoing his words. They clinked their glasses together, the sound carrying a weight far beyond the simple gesture. It wasn't just a toast. It was a symbol of the journey they were on, a journey that included healing old wounds, rebuilding trust, and most importantly, hoping for a future that felt more certain than it had in years. After the toast, John turned to Sophia, a soft smile still on his face. "I've been thinking a lot about your future," he said, his voice warm yet laced with emotion. "I know you've been working so hard for so long taking care of your mother, but I want to know what you want, Sophia. What do you want to do with your life?" Sophia was caught off guard by the question. She had spent so many years focused on survival, on paying bills, making sure her mother was okay, that she hadn't allowed herself the luxury of thinking about her own future. But now, with the weight of those responsibilities lifting, John's question opened a door she hadn't even realized was there. "I don't know," Sophia admitted quietly, her voice soft, vulnerable. "I've never really thought about it. I've always just been focused on getting by." John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Well, now that you don't have to worry as much, maybe it's time to think about what makes you happy. What do you love doing? What makes you feel alive?" Sophia paused, the question sinking in. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, to a time before everything had changed. She remembered how much she had loved to paint. She used to lose herself for hours, creating art that filled her with peace. But that passion had been buried, forgotten beneath the weight of— "I used to love painting," Sophia said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I haven't done it in a long time, but it always made me happy." John's face lit up with encouragement. "Then maybe it's time to start again. You have the talent, Sophia. You have the time now. You could take some classes, really explore it." Sophia felt a spark of excitement stir within her at the idea. It was something she hadn't allowed herself to consider before, but now for the first time it seemed possible. Maybe she could start painting again. Maybe she could even build a life around it. "That sounds nice," Sophia said, smiling for the first time in a long while. "I think I'd like that." John's smile widened. "Then it's settled. We'll make sure you have everything you need to start again." Margaret, who had been listening quietly, reached over and squeezed Sophia's hand. You deserve this, she said softly. You've worked so hard for so long. It's time for you to do something for yourself. Sophia felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so much of her life taking care of others, her mother, her job, even her relationship with John. But now, for the first time, she was allowing herself to think about her own future. It felt strange, but it also felt like a step in the right direction. A step toward something she had longed for, but never allowed herself to fully embrace. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics. They laughed together, shared stories, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia felt a sense of peace. It wasn't just the relief of financial stability, or the comfort of knowing her mother was finally taken care of. It was the sense of belonging, the kind she had always craved but never found. Later, as the sun began to set and they prepared to leave, John walked them to the door. He paused for a moment, looking at both Sophia and Margaret with a deep, heartfelt gratitude. I just want to say, John began, his voice thick with emotion, that I'm so thankful you've both given me a second chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm going to do everything I can to be the father you need, Sophia. And the friend you deserve, Margaret. Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You've earned it, John, she said quietly. We wouldn't be here if we didn't believe in you. Sophia nodded, her heart full. She looked at John, once a distant figure in her life, now standing before her as family. We'll get through this together, she said softly. One step at a time. As they left the mansion that night, the world outside seemed brighter, full of possibility. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still challenges ahead, still wounds that would take time to heal, but it was a new beginning. And for Sophia, that was more than enough. As she walked down the driveway, her hand resting lightly on her mother's arm, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. And for the first time, she felt ready to face it.